of course, acknowledge the beautiful territory we're on. I took a moment this morning to walk with a new friend of mine, Sarah, who's here visiting from Australia. So it's always so great to make these connections with other Indigenous peoples around the globe, especially talking about things like clean energy, environment, climate change. And so her and I took a walk, and it was so nice to just take a minute to have that nice autumn air at home in the Yukon. It is winter, and so for a moment we get to experience autumn, those of us who are here. I wanted to acknowledge Chief Cheesha Tram, Honorable Peter Kirby, and of course Sean Smith. I also see Richard Nirasu, former Premier. So it's great to be here with so many Northerners. And certainly the reflections I'm going to share are about what we've done in the Yukon, but really particularly what's been happening nationally. So about a year and a half ago, I was asked by the national executive, so the regional chiefs and the national chief, to chair the environment and climate change portfolio. Well, at the time, certainly not feeling like I was a perhaps clean energy or climate expert, if you will, but recognize that I come from a territory, Kluane First Nation. Kluane Lake, Kluane Mun, as you may know, has dropped about 8 feet over the last 10 years. You know, the ways in which my grandmother would go out onto the lake, that territory, that way in which she would go on the ice isn't frozen anymore. So realize that, in fact, those of us, especially from small northern communities, we are experts in our own way. We know what it's like every day on the ground to experience the impacts of climate change. And so willingly took on this role and recognized that there was so much there. There's so much that communities are doing. There's so much that communities can do. And so in my role as chair of this committee, was reflecting, well, what is it going to mean for the North? How are we going to ensure that anything happening nationally is going to ensure that communities are fully engaged in the process? And so this is where the ACE committee, if you will, so ICE, ACE, kind of some cool taglines there. The ACE committee welcomes, of course, leaders from each of the 10 regions, but also experts and elders, because that is so important. It also welcomes youth. Because if we are going to make true change, it needs to include everybody. And so what's the role then of women in that space? What's the role then of community, of elders, of youth? How do we ensure that leaders are engaged? How do we ensure that community is engaged? And so the ACE committee is something a bit different at AFN. And I'm really proud of that. But I'm also really proud of the incredible work that's been done. And I know there's some other ACE members. If you could put your hands up, the ACE members in the House, that would be fantastic. There's 2. There's also Tonio and Graham, who are here from the AFN. This committee has done amazing work. And most recently, there was a resolution that was passed at the Chiefs Assembly in Fredericton, following suit from the Vantakwichin declaring a state of emergency, climate crisis, rather, across the Yukon, but nationally as well. So then that becomes the big question, is what are we now going to do? We can declare states of climate crisis, climate emergency, but how are we going to shift to look at different methods of clean energy, different methods of heating, looking at hydro, looking at all of these various options to both minimize carbon footprint, but to ensure that for future generations, and certainly from an Indigenous perspective, that we're thinking about 7 generations out all the time. And so while this work sometimes feels so big and so broad, we go back to where we come from and what we know on the ground, right? It's the stories of our grandparents or our great-grandparents and the changes they've seen. There was a story my cousin shared with me, and I don't know, Sean, if you've heard this one, but there was a Dall sheep that was down by the Takini River subdivision. Totally random, totally bizarre. But the animals are now responding. The fish are now responding. The birds are having to respond. So how does this all link with respect to clean energy? Blair Hogan has done some amazing work at home. I don't know if he's here. He is here somewhere in the House. But looking at biomass projects, right? The innovation that exists within our communities is there and has always been there. We've always had to adapt and we've always had to respond. So how do we take that worldview and apply it to these international spheres of influence? How do we take that worldview and apply it to a national committee? What does that look like? And so this becomes the work of the ACE committee. This becomes the work of the AFN, and oftentimes, and I've heard it in the last many years that I've been engaged, AFN doesn't need to get in the way. AFN just needs to be supportive. And so that becomes part of the work. How do we then just become supportive of what communities are doing? What do communities need from us? How do we then respond? So this declaring of a climate crisis will be followed by a strategy to offer a lens, a First Nations lens to climate action. What does that then mean? My dad told me a story of Copper Lily. She was an elder in the community who came from Copper Center, which was in Alaska. So in the Yukon, a lot of us have ancestry from over that border that never existed before. It's not our border. But Copper Lily is an ancestor of mine. And my dad told me the story, which he allowed me to share when I needed to. Copper Lily told him when he was really, really little that Kluane Lake would become a river. So you need to get ready. And so, in the last 10 years, we've seen Kluane Lake, Luadman, go down by 8 feet. So for those of you who joined us in Kluane just last year to launch the wind energy project, you might have been driving along and seeing beautiful Sheep Mountain. Now what you see is sand. It's totally bizarre. That beautiful green teal water that looks like you could be maybe in the Caribbean or Mexico, that is a trick. It is not true. It is glacier fed, so be careful. But rather when you're driving, there was an island we'd all joke about paddling out to as kids. You can't paddle there anymore because it's not an island. So those impacts, the sheep coming down, the sheep then being at risk of being hunted because they're so familiar with people. They were protected in the sanctuary, in the park. Now they're not. They come over that highway, then what happens? So this becomes the issues on the ground that communities are dealing with, and it's leadership like Chief Tisha Tram, it's leaders like Sean Smith, it's the young people in community like Bobby Rose who are saying, wait a minute, we need to make serious changes here. And so that then becomes the role of AFN. How can we respond? How can we be supportive? And there's a lot of work to do in this space, there's no question. But certainly ensuring that our values, who we are, our experiences, our histories, being experts of what we know, that becomes another part of the work that we need to ensure is included. Nationally, internationally, in every space and place. And so when I think about the walk that Sarah and I took and the similarities that we have with Australia, how then do we support each other? From a community perspective, from a regional perspective, from a national perspective, from an international perspective. And notice that it's not a hierarchy, right? It's a lateral piece.